The year is 1939. In the frozen forests of Finland, a story that defies all military logic is about to be written in blood and snow. 11,000 Finnish soldiers, farmers, and lumberjacks who learned to shoot before they could read are about to face a Soviet army more than 10 times their size. What happened in those dark winter months would forever change the way the world understood warfare, proving that sometimes the land itself can become the deadliest weapon of all. But before I reveal the most chilling details of this massacre, I need you to do something for me. If this story already has you hooked the same way it had me when I first discovered it, show it by hitting that like button right now. Because I promise you, what comes next will shatter every expectation you have about what ordinary men can achieve when fighting for their homeland in conditions that would kill most soldiers before they ever fired a shot. Our story begins not in the chaos of battle, but in the quiet determination of a nation that refused to surrender. On November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Union launched a massive invasion of Finland with over 500,000 troops, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft. Joseph Stalin believed this would be a quick war, a matter of weeks at most before the tiny Nordic nation capitulated. His generals assured him that the Red Army would be in Helsinki by Christmas, that Finnish resistance would crumble like snow under a tank's treads. They were catastrophically wrong. Finland was a nation of only 3.5 million people facing a Soviet giant of nearly 200 million. On paper, it was no contest. The Soviets had more men, more guns, more of everything. But what Stalin and his commanders failed to understand was that they weren't just invading a country. They were invading a way of life. Every Finnish man grew up in these forests. They learned to ski before they could walk properly, to hunt in conditions that would kill unprepared men in hours, to navigate through wilderness where a wrong turn meant death. These weren't professional soldiers in the traditional sense. They were something far more dangerous. They were men fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence, and they knew every tree, every frozen lake, every hidden path in the landscape that was about to become a graveyard. The Soviet plan for the invasion was built on overwhelming force and rapid movement. Multiple armies would strike simultaneously across the long Finnish border, crushing resistance through sheer numbers. One of these thrusts aimed straight at the small town of Suomussalmi, a strategic crossroads in eastern Finland. If the Soviets could capture it, they would cut Finland in half and open the path to the vital port of Oulu on the Gulf of Bothnia. The mission was assigned to the Soviet 163rd Rifle Division, a force of over 15,000 men commanded by a capable officer who believed, like everyone else in the Red Army, that this would be a straightforward operation. The division was well equipped by Soviet standards, with artillery, tanks, and supply columns stretching for miles. They marched into Finland with confidence, expecting token resistance at best. What they found instead was a nightmare that would haunt Soviet military planning for generations. The 163rd Division crossed the border on November 30th and began advancing toward Suomussalmi along the only road that could support their heavy vehicles and supply trucks. This was their first mistake, though they didn't know it yet. In the vast Finnish wilderness, there were few roads, and the ones that existed were narrow, winding through dense forest and skirting frozen lakes. The Soviets, trained for the open steppes of Russia, saw these roads as lifelines. The Finns saw them as traps. Defending Suomussalmi was a force that barely deserved the name. A few hundred Finnish soldiers, local reservists and border guards, men who days earlier had been working their farms or cutting timber. They had almost no heavy weapons, limited ammunition, and no hope of stopping a division-sized assault. Their orders were simple and seemingly impossible. Delay the Soviet advance as long as possible while reinforcements were gathered. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. These few hundred Finns didn't try to hold a defensive line. Instead, they melted into the forest and began a campaign of harassment that drove the Soviet commanders to distraction. Small groups of Finnish ski troops would appear from the trees, fire a devastating volley, and vanish before the Soviets could respond. Supply trucks were ambushed and burned. Officers were picked off by invisible snipers. Patrols sent into the forest simply disappeared, their frozen bodies found weeks later, if they were found at all. The Soviets, confined to the road by the deep snow and their heavy equipment, could do nothing but keep marching forward, bleeding men with every kilometer. By December 8th, the 163rd Division had captured Suomussalmi, but it was a hollow victory. They had taken 9 days to advance a distance they should have covered in 2, and they had lost hundreds of men doing it. Worse, they were now deep in hostile territory, strung out along a single vulnerable road, with Finnish forces harassing them from every direction. The division's commander sent urgent requests for reinforcements and supplies. The temperature was dropping rapidly, already reaching -20 Celsius, and his men, equipped for a quick autumn campaign, were suffering terribly from the cold. Stalin, furious at the slow progress, ordered the 44th Rifle Division to advance and support the 163rd. This was an elite unit, battle-hardened from combat in Ukraine, with over 18,000 men, tanks, artillery, and even some of the Red Army's best officers. Surely, the Soviet High Command reasoned, 2 divisions totaling over 33,000 men would be more than enough to crush whatever resistance the Finns could muster. They had no idea that they were sending these men into the most perfectly designed killing ground in military history. While the Soviets were struggling forward, the Finnish High Command was working frantically to organize a response. They scraped together every available unit, pulling men from other sectors, calling up reservists, even releasing prisoners who could fight. Command of the operation was given to Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo, a 43-year-old officer who understood winter warfare better than perhaps any man alive. Silasvuo was not a typical military commander. He had grown up in these forests, had spent his entire life in the Finnish wilderness, and he possessed an almost supernatural understanding of how to use the terrain and weather as weapons. When he arrived at Suomussalmi and saw the tactical situation, he didn't see a disaster. He saw an opportunity. The Soviets had made a fatal error. They had advanced deep into Finland along a single road, creating a column that stretched for dozens of kilometers through dense forest. They were like a snake that had swallowed a meal too large, unable to move quickly, unable to defend itself properly, completely dependent on that one road for supplies, reinforcements, and retreat. Silasvuo's plan was brutally simple in concept, but would require perfect execution and incredible courage from his men. He would use a tactic that the Finns called motti, named after the bundles of firewood that Finnish families prepared for winter. Just as you would split a large log into smaller pieces that could be burned, Silasvuo would split the Soviet divisions into isolated pockets that could be destroyed one by one. The Finnish forces, now numbering around 11,000 men, would use their superior mobility on skis to strike at multiple points along the Soviet column simultaneously, cutting it into segments. Each segment would be surrounded, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, and systematically annihilated. The Soviets, unable to maneuver off the roads in the deep snow, would be helpless. It was a plan that required the Finns to attack an enemy 3 times their size, in multiple places at once, in the middle of a Finnish winter, that was rapidly becoming one of the coldest in decades. It should have been impossible. But Silasvuo knew his men, and he knew what they were capable of. On December 27th, as the temperature plummeted to -35°C, the Finnish counterattack began. The first strikes hit the 163rd Division in Suomussalmi itself. Finnish ski troops, moving silently through the forest in white camouflage that made them invisible against the snow, attacked from every direction at once. They struck at dawn, when the Soviet soldiers were at their most vulnerable, huddled around fires trying to stay warm, their weapons often frozen and useless. The Finns moved like ghosts, appearing from the trees, unleashing devastating fire, and disappearing before the Soviets could organize a response. But this wasn't just a raid. This was the beginning of a systematic destruction. While some Finnish units attacked the town, others were moving through the forest to cut the road behind the Soviet position. They didn't need to hold the road, just block it long enough to prevent retreat and reinforcement. They felled trees across the narrow track, destroyed bridges, and set up ambush positions at every choke point. Within hours, the 163rd Division was cut off, surrounded by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't catch, and couldn't escape. The Soviet commander, realizing the desperate situation, ordered his men to break out to the east, back toward the Soviet border. But the Finns had anticipated this. Every attempt to retreat was met with withering fire from the forest. Soviet soldiers, trying to move through snow that was waist-deep, made easy targets for Finnish marksmen who could ski circles around them. The temperature continued to drop, reaching -40°C. At this temperature, metal becomes brittle, engines refuse to start, and exposed skin freezes in minutes. The Soviet soldiers, many of them from Ukraine and southern Russia, had never experienced cold like this. They had been issued winter uniforms, but these were designed for Russian winters, not the extreme conditions of northern Finland. Men began to freeze to death even as they fought. Frostbite claimed more casualties than bullets in some units. Soldiers huddled around fires, making themselves perfect targets because the alternative was freezing to death in the darkness. The Finns, dressed in layers of wool and fur, moving constantly to stay warm, were in their element. This was the winter they had known all their lives, harsh but familiar. They could fight in conditions that incapacitated their enemies. Meanwhile, the 44th Division was advancing along a parallel road to the south, unaware that the 163rd was being destroyed. This elite unit was confident, well-equipped, and led by experienced officers who had fought in multiple campaigns. They expected to link up with the 163rd, crush the Finnish resistance, and complete the mission. Instead, they were marching into the same trap. Silasvuo, monitoring the situation carefully, waited until the 44th Division was fully committed to the narrow forest road before striking. On December 1st, Finnish ski troops hit the Soviet column at multiple points simultaneously, cutting it into segments just as they had done to the 163rd. The 44th Division, stretched out over nearly 20 kilometers of road, suddenly found itself split into isolated pockets, each one surrounded by Finnish forces that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Now, you might be wondering, how could 11,000 men even dream of defeating over 30,000? The answer lies not in superior firepower or numbers, but in the fundamental nature of winter. Warfare in the Finnish wilderness, something the Soviets had catastrophically failed to understand. Mobility was everything, and the Finns had it while the Soviets did not. But before I reveal the exact moment this battle turned into one of history's most one-sided massacres, I need your help spreading this unbelievable story. Share this video now because what comes next will defy everything you thought you knew about the limits of human endurance and the power of fighting on your home ground. The motti tactic that Siilasvuo employed was devastatingly effective because it exploited every Soviet weakness while maximizing every Finnish advantage. The Soviet divisions, confined to the roads by their heavy equipment and the deep snow, could only move in column. When the Finns cut the roads, these columns became isolated segments, each one unable to support the others. The Soviets had superior numbers overall, but at each point of contact, the Finns could concentrate their forces to achieve local superiority. A Soviet pocket might contain 1,000 men, but they were trapped in a small area, unable to maneuver, while the Finns could attack from any direction through the forest. The Finnish ski troops moved with a speed that seemed impossible to the Soviets. They could cover 50 kilometers in a night, strike at dawn, and be gone before reinforcements arrived. They knew every trail, every frozen lake that could be crossed, every ridge that offered a firing position. The Soviets, by contrast, were lost in an alien landscape, where every tree looked the same, and every direction led deeper into hostile wilderness. The Finnish tactics were refined through brutal trial and error. Small units, usually platoon or company-sized, would approach a Soviet pocket through the forest, moving in complete silence. They wore white camouflage that made them invisible against the snow. They wrapped their equipment in cloth to prevent noise. They moved in single file, each man stepping in the tracks of the man ahead to minimize the trail. When they reached their attack position, usually within 100 meters of the Soviet position, they would wait for the signal. The attacks came at dawn or dusk, when the light was poor and the Soviets were changing guard or trying to prepare food. The Finns would open fire with everything they had: rifles, submachine guns, light machine guns, creating a storm of lead that swept through the Soviet positions. The Soviets, caught by surprise, would scramble for their weapons, but in the extreme cold, many guns wouldn't fire. Oil froze, mechanisms jammed, and men's fingers were too numb to work the actions. By the time they organized a response, the Finns were already falling back into the forest, leaving behind dozens of dead and wounded. But the motti tactic wasn't just about the attacks. It was about the siege that followed. Once a Soviet pocket was isolated, the Finns didn't need to assault it directly. They could simply wait while winter did the work for them. Cut off from supplies, the Soviets ran out of food, ammunition, and most critically, firewood. Without fire, men froze to death in their sleep. The Finns would occasionally attack, just enough to keep the Soviets from organizing, to prevent them from building proper defenses or attempting a breakout. They would target officers, radio operators, anyone who looked like they might be coordinating the defense. Soviet morale, already shaken by the cold and the invisible enemy, began to collapse. The 44th Division, which had entered Finland with such confidence, was being systematically destroyed. The division was cut into more than a dozen separate pockets, each one surrounded and under constant attack. The largest pocket, containing the division headquarters and several thousand men, was trapped on the road near the village of Rate. The commander, realizing the desperate situation, ordered his men to build defensive positions and wait for relief. But relief wasn't coming. The Soviet High Command, finally understanding the scale of the disaster, tried to send reinforcements, but these units were ambushed and destroyed before they could reach the trapped divisions. The Finns controlled the forest, and nothing moved on the roads without their permission. Inside the Soviet pockets, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food ran out within days. Ammunition was rationed, then ran out entirely in some positions. The cold was relentless, -40 Celsius day after day, with no shelter except what could be improvised from overturned vehicles and piled snow. Men huddled together for warmth, but still they froze. Frostbite was universal. Soldiers lost fingers, toes, entire limbs to the cold. Medical supplies were exhausted almost immediately, and the wounded simply froze to death because there was no way to keep them warm. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the physical suffering. The Soviets were trapped in a nightmare landscape, surrounded by an enemy they rarely saw but who could kill them at any moment. The forest itself seemed hostile, every shadow potentially concealing a Finnish sniper, every sound possibly the prelude to another attack. Men began to crack under the strain, some simply walking off into the forest to die, others turning their weapons on themselves. The Finnish attacks continued with mechanical precision. Siilasvuo rotated his units, keeping fresh troops in contact with the enemy, while others rested and resupplied. The Finns were tired, cold, and hungry too, but they were fighting for their homes, and they could see that they were winning. Every day brought news of another Soviet pocket destroyed, another few hundred enemies killed or captured. The morale difference was stark. The Finns were exhausted but determined. The Soviets were broken. On January 5, 1940, Siilasvuo decided the time had come to finish the 163rd Division. His troops had been besieging the Soviet positions around Suomussalmi for over a week, and the enemy was on the verge of collapse. He ordered a final assault, concentrating his forces for a decisive blow. The attack began at dawn on January 8th, with temperatures still hovering around -40 Celsius. Finnish artillery, carefully husbanded throughout the campaign, opened fire on the Soviet positions. It wasn't much by the standards of major battles, just a few batteries, but against an enemy that was already demoralized and freezing, it was devastating. Under cover of the barrage, Finnish infantry advanced on skis, moving quickly across the snow. The Soviet defense was sporadic and disorganized. Many men were too weak from cold and hunger to fight effectively. Others had already decided that surrender was preferable to freezing to death. Within hours, the Finnish flag was flying over Suomussalmi, and the remnants of the 163rd Division were fleeing east in complete disorder. But there was no escape. The Finns pursued relentlessly, harrying the retreating Soviets every step of the way. Men who fell behind were left to freeze. Equipment was abandoned. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. Of the 15,000 men who had marched into Suomussalmi with such confidence in early December, fewer than half made it back to Soviet territory, and many of those were so badly frostbitten that they would never fight again. The 44th Division's fate was even worse. Trapped in multiple pockets along the Rate Road, cut off from all support, the division was being annihilated piece by piece. The largest pocket, containing the division headquarters, held out until January 7th, when Siilasvuo concentrated his forces for a final assault. The Finns attacked from all sides simultaneously, overwhelming the weakened Soviet defenses in a matter of hours. The division commander was killed in the fighting, and organized resistance collapsed. What followed was not so much a battle as a slaughter. Soviet soldiers, many of them too weak to run, were cut down as they tried to flee. Others surrendered in droves, grateful just to be taken prisoner where they might have a chance of warmth and food. The Finns, though they had fought with ruthless efficiency, were not cruel. They took prisoners when they could, though feeding and housing thousands of captured Soviets in the middle of winter was a challenge they were barely equipped to handle. By January 9th, the Battle of Suomussalmi was over. 2 Soviet divisions, over 33,000 men, had been effectively destroyed by a Finnish force one-third their size. Soviet casualties were staggering. At least 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured, though some estimates put the true figure even higher. Thousands more died from frostbite and exposure in the weeks that followed. The Finns captured enormous quantities of equipment: tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, thousands of rifles, and desperately needed supplies. Finnish casualties, by contrast, were remarkably light: around 900 men killed and 1,700 wounded. The disparity was almost unbelievable, a casualty ratio of more than 10-1 in favor of the defenders. The victory at Suomussalmi sent shockwaves around the world. Here was proof that the mighty Soviet Red Army was not invincible, that superior numbers and equipment meant nothing if the tactics and conditions were wrong. The battle became a symbol of Finnish resistance, proof that a small nation could stand against a giant if its people were willing to fight. But the impact went far beyond symbolism. The disaster at Suomussalmi, combined with similar defeats elsewhere along the Finnish front, forced Stalin to completely reorganize his invasion strategy. The quick victory he had promised turned into a grinding war of attrition that would last until March 1940. The Red Army would eventually win through sheer weight of numbers, but the cost was enormous: over 125,000 Soviet soldiers dead and many more wounded. The Finns, though ultimately forced to cede territory, had proven their point. They had shown the world that they would not surrender without a fight, and they had inflicted such damage on the Soviets that Stalin would think twice before threatening Finland again. The Battle of Suomussalmi also had profound implications for World War II. Adolf Hitler, watching the Soviet performance in Finland, became convinced that the Red Army was weak and poorly led. This assessment would play a major role in his decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941, a decision that would ultimately lead to Nazi Germany's destruction. The Soviets, for their part, learned hard lessons from Finland. They reformed their tactics, improved their winter equipment, and trained their troops for forest warfare. When the Germans invaded, the Red Army was far better prepared than it had been in Finland, and those lessons learned in the frozen forests would help turn the tide on the Eastern Front. For the Finns, Suomussalmi became a source of national pride that endures to this day. The battle proved that Finnish sisu, that untranslatable quality of determination and resilience, was more than just a cultural myth. It was a real force that could change the course of history. Colonel Silas Vuo became a national hero, eventually rising to the rank of general and commanding Finnish forces throughout the continuation war against the Soviets from 1941 to 1944. But he always maintained that the true heroes were the ordinary Finnish soldiers, the farmers and lumberjacks who had fought in conditions that would have broken professional armies. The Soviet commanders, by contrast, faced Stalin's wrath. Many were recalled to Moscow and executed or sent to the gulags, scapegoats for a disaster that was as much the fault of poor planning and underestimating the enemy as it was of individual leadership failures. The commander of the 44th Division died in battle. Perhaps a better fate than what awaited those who survived to face Stalin's judgment. The motti tactic pioneered at Suomussalmi would be used throughout the Winter War and again in the Continuation War. It became the defining characteristic of Finnish military doctrine, a way for a small nation to fight effectively against a much larger enemy. The tactic required intimate knowledge of the terrain, superior mobility, and soldiers who could operate independently in small units. The Finns had all of these advantages, and they used them to devastating effect. But perhaps the most important lesson of Suomussalmi is about the nature of warfare itself. The battle proved that technology and numbers, while important, are not decisive by themselves. Morale, training, leadership, and, above all, fighting on terrain you understand against an enemy who doesn't, can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The Soviets had every material advantage, but they were fighting in an environment that negated those advantages and amplified their weaknesses. The Finns, by contrast, were fighting on their home ground, in conditions they had known all their lives, for a cause they believed in absolutely. That combination proved unstoppable. The frozen forests of Suomussalmi became a graveyard for Soviet ambitions, a place where the myth of Red Army invincibility died in the snow. Today, if you visit Suomussalmi, you can still see reminders of the battle. There are monuments to the Finnish soldiers who fought there, museums displaying captured Soviet equipment, and in the forest, if you know where to look, you can still find rusted remnants of the vehicles and weapons abandoned in that desperate winter. The battle has been studied by military historians around the world as a textbook example of how to fight a defensive war against a superior enemy. The tactics used by Vuo and his men have been analyzed, adapted, and taught in military academies from West Point to Sandhurst. But no amount of study can fully capture what it was like to fight in those conditions. To ski through -40-degree cold, knowing that the enemy was all around you, to attack an enemy that outnumbered you 3-1, and somehow emerge victorious. That requires something that can't be taught in a classroom. It requires the kind of courage and determination that only comes from fighting for your home, your family, your very survival. The men who fought at Suomussalmi were not superhuman. They were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and they rose to meet the challenge in a way that still inspires us today. They were cold, hungry, exhausted, and outnumbered. But they never gave up. They fought with intelligence, courage, and a deep understanding of the land they were defending. And in the end, they achieved what everyone said was impossible. They defeated an enemy that should have crushed them, and in doing so, they wrote one of the most remarkable chapters in military history. The story of Suomussalmi reminds us that the outcome of any conflict is never predetermined. That determination, ingenuity, and fighting for something you believe in can overcome the longest odds. It shows us that sometimes the greatest victories come not from having the most resources, but from using what you have with maximum effectiveness. And it proves that a small group of committed people, fighting for their homeland, can change the course of history. As we close this tale of snow and blood, of impossible odds and unlikely victory, I want you to think about what these Finnish soldiers achieved. They faced an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1 in conditions that would kill most people in hours, and they not only survived but triumphed. Their story is a testament to human resilience, to the power of fighting for something greater than yourself, and to the fact that sometimes, just sometimes, David really can defeat Goliath. If this story moved you the way it moved me, if you're amazed by what these ordinary men achieved in the frozen forests of Finland, then do me a favor. Don't just watch this and move on. Hit that like button to show that stories like this matter, that we should remember the incredible things people are capable of when they refuse to give up. And subscribe, because history is full of moments like this, battles and events that defy belief, that show us the extremes of human capability. I'll be here, digging through the archives, finding these stories, and bringing them to you. Because if we don't remember what people like the soldiers of Suomussalmi achieved, if we don't tell their stories and learn from their example, then we risk forgetting what we ourselves are capable of when the moment demands it. The frozen forests of Finland remember. Now you will too.